We were just talking there about the potential for conflict in our region. Many see that as very real. But right now, there is a real war, of course, going on in the Middle East. And that civil war in Syria has escalated on a very different front over the weekend. Israel now engaging in armed conflict with Iran and Syria. Now, Jonathan Schanzer is Vice President of the Research at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. He writes a lot about the region. He's in Australia as a guest of the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council. I spoke to him earlier. Jonathan Schanzer, nice to have you on the program. I want to go straight to the situation that's happening now between Israel and Syria. Just the circumstances as you understand it, the plane crashing, it was under fire. Is there the potential now for an escalation here?
Well, I think the escalation actually began when the Iranians sent a drone into Israeli airspace. That was Saturday morning. This was apparently a drone that was reverse engineered. It was a drone, an American drone that crash landed in Afghanistan. The Iranians reverse engineered it and possibly armed their version of it, sent it into Israeli airspace. That's when the Israelis responded, and not only responded by attacking the Iranian base from where the drone was launched, but then also responded by taking out approximately about another dozen targets.
And then, of course, the jet fighter itself being lost.
That's right. So out of the 8 F-16s that were sent into Syrian airspace, 1 came back hobbled. My understanding was that it was overwhelmed with anti-aircraft surface-to-air missiles, that roughly 24 of them were shot in the direction of this one plane, and the plane was unable to execute some of the evasive maneuvers and ultimately was hobbled and flew into Israeli airspace where the pilots ejected. And
now, of course, we're seeing an action from Israel, and the concern here that this could escalate further, that we could see Israel dragged even more into what has been a murky conflict in Syria with so many different countries, so many different actors involved. Does that concern you?
Look, it is absolutely disconcerting. What I would say, though, is that most of the actors are not threatening Israel. Even ISIS, Nusra Front, the range of jihadi actors
potentially hostile.
Potentially hostile. Certainly
and
no
Iran,
fans
certainly.
No fans of Israel. It's the Iranians that the Israelis are concerned with. That the Iranians have exploited the fog of war, that they have taken advantage of the chaos of the situation to install assets. And these assets are what the Israelis have been watching for the last several years. They've been watching the buildup. And what we saw on Saturday morning was the Israelis taking out a number of targets that had concerned them over the course of several months or even several years.
So is there the potential now for, and Syria has been a place where various factions have had their own wars under the umbrella of the Syrian civil war. Is there a potential here now that we see Iran and Israel dragged into a conflict themselves within the Syrian conflict?
I think there is a potential for conflict in Syria between Iran and Israel. I think certainly that's already happened.
But from that point, broadening outside of the Syrian conflict or contained within it?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to recognize the fact that you have Hezbollah in Lebanon. It has been armed up by the Iranians for exactly this moment in time.
And has been in conflict with Israel.
That's right. They have about 150 to 180,000 rockets currently facing south at Israel. Not to mention now these assets that we're seeing that Iran controls inside Syria. I think the goal of the Iranians is to drag Israel into a two-front conflict and to pull the Israelis into the morass of the Syria civil war. It's already complicated enough, as you noted, and I think the last thing the Israelis want is to be dragged into this. However, they see the need to neutralize a number of these assets because the longer they wait, the more difficult that next round of conflict could become.
You've been speaking to people inside Israel. What's the mood there at the moment in terms of the response from Israel? How far should it go? How much restraint should it show? How does Israel conduct itself?
Look, I think the way that I would describe what's going on in Israel right now is a deliberation about whether there needs to be more done to neutralize the Iranian assets that they've been observing inside Syria, or whether they respond to the next conflict. So in other words, is this preemptive or is it responsive? The Israelis in past conflicts have always tried to gain the upper hand by going in and setting the terms of this conflict. The problem is, over the last several years, the Iranians have been dictating the terms. I think there's a certain amount amount of frustration among Israeli war planners right now.
So which would you be leaning to? Do you believe it would be more preemptive than responsive? And I suppose the question then becomes, to what extent does Israel conduct those operations?
Well, I think that actually what we just saw was a preemptive series of strikes in response to one provocation.
So it's a combination of preemption and response.
And so in other words, anytime Iran does this now, I think moving forward, I think the Israelis will not just respond by taking out the drone, for example, or hitting the drone base, but actually taking out a number of other targets as well that they have in that target bank.
This conflict in Syria, what we've seen now with Israel and Iran, it is indicative of a region that has been so complicated. There have been so many different conflicts playing out simultaneously. You follow the region, you write about the region. From the outside looking in, it appears to be just intractable. Saudi versus Iran, Israel versus Iran, the various actors inside Syria, Israel and Palestine, Hezbollah. There are so many different actors and so many different disputes. How do you even begin to work through it?
Look, I think that there is a lot of chaos. I think certainly the Syria civil war, the war in Yemen, for example, is another.
Which is a Saudi-Iran proxy war.
That's right, that's right. So in some of these cases, I think it does look intractable, it looks rather messy. In some cases, though, we're seeing some interesting shifts that the Israelis and some of the Gulf Arab states, notably the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, that they're now beginning to look at the region in somewhat of the same way. I don't want to say here that they've become allies, but they certainly are less enemies than they used to be. And so amidst all of the bad news, amidst all of the chaos, we see some inklings of maybe how the neighborhood may be changing. So it may not all be bad news. That said, we are still seeing a lot of bad news.
And just finally, of course, one of the longest running disputes, the Israelis and the Palestinians, President Trump recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. Yes, there was criticism from the Palestinians, an angry response, but there was also support from other sectors as well. I know you've supported the move itself, but is it something that's going to set back the chances of moving to a two-state solution, or is it the disruption that may actually create a catalyst for change?
What I would say is that, first of all, the move was really more of a bureaucratic one than anything.
It had been on the books for a long time.
That's right. I mean, first of all, Congress had called for it, but also the U.S. decision doesn't influence the final status negotiations. In other words, the Israelis and Palestinians still have to negotiate what Jerusalem means to both sides, and they have to agree to it. What Trump did was basically just say, look, this is where the embassy is going to be. It's where we're going to do the bulk of our diplomatic engagement, and it's recognizing Jerusalem for the capital that it already is. We know that. Now, what's interesting, though, is that Trump has begun to address the question of Jerusalem. He's beginning to challenge the refugee status through one of the UN agencies that handles this, UNRWA. He's beginning to address, he's softening the ground on some of these core issues. And I think he's trying to push both sides toward an agreement. The question is either side ready right now? And arguably, probably not.
That has always been the question, hasn't it? And exactly what terms they are prepared to negotiate on. Good to talk to you. Enjoy your time in Australia.
Thank you.